What is up guys, Vampire with a Rep Paladin 6.2 PvP guide. Now I know this is pretty late being that it's almost halfway through the season already, but I'm going to do it anyways. Right now Rep Paladins are in a pretty bad place for PvP right now, being that we're one of the weakest DPS in the game and that we're restricted to 1 or 2 comps, being Cupid and Vanguard's Cleave. Even with these restrictions, look at Avenging, he's still in rank 1 range, so this guy is pretty much a guide to show you how you can be as good as Avenging. I'm just kidding on that part, but it should help you out still. Now in this guide I'm going to be going over stat priority and gear, your talents and glyphs, some helpful macros, and your general rotation. Now let's get into the guide. Now let's get into stat priority and gear. Stat priority, you're going to want to go strength, then verse, then mastery and haste, then multi-strike, then crit. Now for strength is pretty obvious being that it's your main DPS stat. Now for verse, red is generally a switchy class, so you're going to want to have verse for the damage resistance. It also helps with the healing and the damage increase. Next is mastery and haste. Mastery is really good because it increases the damage of your big DPS moves like Templar's Verdict. Now for haste. Haste is really good because it decreases your global cooldown and cast time, and it also increases your attack speed. Next is multi-strike and crit. You don't have to really worry about those, you just don't really want them. You'd rather have the other stats like verse, mastery, and haste. Now for gear. For gear, you'd imagine you want to stack full verse for everything, but some pieces are awkward and they're like verse crit or verse multi-strike, and you don't really want those. Instead of getting those pieces, if there's an option to get a haste mastery piece, you'd prefer to getting that. So I test out gear quite a bit, so the set I have on right now is probably the best. The only difference you want to probably make is to have versatility and chance instead of mastery. I just have mastery on because I play Final Verdict and it gives me bigger burst. Now let's get into talents and glyphs. Now for tier 15, you're probably going to have Pursuit of Justice because it's just the best overall mobility for red. Now for tier 30, you're going to probably just want to go Fist of Justice because Repentance and Blinding Light just aren't good enough. Now in tier 45, you have a couple options in Selfless Healer and Sacred Shield. Selfless Healer is really good because it gives you procs from your judgment that increase the effectiveness of your Flash of Light. The procs increase your healing and decrease the cast time. They can be really good for burst healing, like you can get massive 150k heals just from proc. Now for Sacred Shield. Sacred Shield is good against single target purge heavy comps. It's really good because you can only purge the shield, you can't purge the buff making the shield, so it's really good to protect your other buffs. And on top of that, it's an 11k shield that pops up every 6 seconds, so that's also helpful. Now for tier 60, you have a lot of options. You have Hand of Purity, Unbreakable Spirit, and Clemency. They're all good, but for different reasons. Hand of Purity is really good against dot comps, like LSD, WLS. Unbreakable Spirit is really good against like God comp, because you can't really get the sacks off because you're usually in CC during the volleys. Now for Clemency is good against mostly everything else because it gets your healer out of CC, you have extra buffs and freedoms. Now I'm going to do tier 90 first because tier 75 and 100 kind of match up together. So for tier 90, you're going to want Execution Sentence. It's just because the heals from Execution Sentence are just so good that there's no point in not taking it. Now for tier 75 and 100, you can either go Holy Avenger or Sanctified Wrath. Divine Purpose just doesn't proc enough to make it worth it. For Holy Avenger is really good when you're running Final Verdict. It gives you a really strong and powerful burst. Also with Final Verdict, you have good consistent damage with your Divine Storm procs. Sanctified Wrath is really good because it increases the length of your wings and it makes it so that you can use Hammer of Righteousness every single global. So those hit really hard. Paired with Empowered Seals, it's really good because Empowered Seals can increase your attack power by 50%, so those Hammers of Righteousness will be hitting like a truck. Empowered Seals also has numerous advantages based on what seals you use. Seal of Insight makes it so that you have a buff that heals you for 2% of your health every 3 seconds for 21 seconds, so in short, you pretty much have second wind. Now Seal of Justice is really good because it increases your movement speed on top of slowing your opponent's movement speed. This, added on with Pursuit of Justice and the Cloak movement speed buff, makes it so that you can keep up with just about any opponent. This can be really helpful while training a healer or any other slippery DPS. It makes it so you can stick on them and do more damage to them. It's really good to keep Seal of Resistance up when you're bursting. You don't want to have the actual seal up though, you just want to have the buff because the seal itself, it can break your CC, while the buff itself just increases your haste by 20%, which is really good when bursting. Now for Seal of Truth, you want to keep Seal of Truth up at almost all times. It just gives you an all-around 50% damage buff, so that's really good. Now let's get into glyphs. Now, one glyph that you want to have up almost all the time is Glyph of Templar's Verdict. It makes it so that you have 10% less damage taken when you've recently used Templar's Verdict and Exorcism. So it's really good against almost always because red is pretty squishy and you kind of need it or else you'll get global. Another important glyph is Glyph of Divine Protection. Divine Protection makes it so that you take 20% less damage to physical attackers. So if you're playing a comp that has physical DPS and you don't have the glyph, your wall is pretty much useless against them. However, you never want to have this against a caster cleave, like God comp, because then you'll just be taking 20% more damage when you could be having a 40% wall rather than a 20% wall. Now for that third glyph stop, you have a couple of options. You can use Hand of Freedom, Flash of Light, Burden of Guilt, or Word of Glory. Word of Glory is really good because every single time you use WOG on yourself, it gives you a 3% attack buff for every holy power you use. So this is really good because you get an increased damage buff and you're healing yourself. Burden of Guilt is really helpful when you don't have consistent slow. Whenever you judgment an enemy, it decreases their movement speed by 50%. This can be really good for keeping up with enemies or peeling your teammates. Now Flash of Light is pretty good if you're going to have an instance where you're just going to be spam healing yourself for a while. It's really good when it's paired up with Selfless Healer because you can get the instant cast Flash of Light into a Execution Sentence for a 10% increased healing. Next up is Hand of Freedom Glyph. Hand of Freedom Glyph is probably one of the best glyphs Ret have, but it's sometimes hard to use. Whenever you use it on a teammate, it decreases the CC on them by 25% as long as Hand of Freedom is up. Even if they're already in a CC and you use it on them, it still shortens the CC on them. But the problem is sometimes it's really hard to get on them when you're getting cross CC'd and stuff like that. Now let's get into macros. Macros are helpful little things that make it so you can use your abilities more efficiently. Now when getting into macros, you can do it in two ways. You can have /focus equals blank, or you can have arena 1, 2, 3. Personally, I do the /focus blank macros. So first off, your most important macros are probably Hand of Sacrifice, Hand of Protection, and Hand of Freedom. For Hand of Sacrifice, you want to probably make a macro with one with your healer and one with the other DPS in it. Now for Bop, or Hand of Protection, you're going to want to have one for your DPS, yourself, and your healer. Now for Freedom, you're going to want to do the same thing as Hand of Protection, one for your DPS, your healer, and yourself. So first off, your most important macros are probably Hand of Sacrifice, Hand of Protection, and Hand of Freedom. Next, what you probably want is to have a Focus Hodge macro. What it does is it makes it so that you use Hammer of Justice on your focus target. This is helpful because it's faster than actually targeting and then using Hodge. Also, it makes it so that the healer doesn't have a chance to predict you to Hodge after targeting them and ground or sack. Another important macro is to have a Cleanse macro for yourself, your DPS, and your healer. What this does is you can get wyverns and other diseases and poisons off your DPS to decrease damage and CC. Now for Execution Sentence. For Execution Sentence, you probably want to have 4 macros. One for the person you're attacking if you want to use for damage, and the other 3 for yourself, your DPS, and your healer. You don't want to actually have the actual ability on your bar sometimes, because if you accidentally click that while targeting an enemy when you want to heal yourself, you accidentally use it for damage instead of healing, and that can lose you a game sometimes. Next up, I have macros for WOG and Flash of Light. What they are is I have one for myself, my healer, and my DPS. It's so that I don't have to target them, and it's a lot faster than actually targeting them and then clicking the heal. Now let's get into rotation. Your general rotation is probably going to be Judgment, then Crusader Strike, then Exorcism, and then Templar's Verdict. This can vary at times based on holy power, because Crusader Strike, Judgment, and Exorcism all have a cooldown, so sometimes they're not always up. Also, Exorcism and Divine Storm can proc, so those can change things up. Now for your Exorcism and Divine Storm procs. Whenever you get Divine Storm proc when you're running Final Verdict, you want to make sure to use Final Verdict before you use it so you get the increased damage buff. Also, you want to make sure that you're not near any CC in case you wreck it. Now for Exorcism, you want to use the proc whenever it's up, unless you have Judgment up. You want to use Judgment before the proc. Now I know I didn't do the Empowered Seals rotation, but I just am not familiar enough with it right now because I haven't really used Empowered Seals, but I'll get into a separate video about that. Next up, I'm going to show you your burst rotation with Final Verdict. When bursting, pretty much you're going to want to use your Final Verdict whenever it's up. So pretty much your rotation is going to be Judgment into Final Verdict, into Righteous Hammer, into Final Verdict, into Exorcism, into Final Verdict, etc. Also, you're probably going to want to use your Divine Storm procs whenever you can after you use a Final Verdict. It just increases your damage a lot. Here's an example of your normal rotation. Now, as you can see, you're not always going to have 100% uptime, being that all your moves have a cooldown, and sometimes you can't connect with the Crusader strikes because they're not going to be in range for it, but this is the most efficient way in my opinion. Now here's just an example of your general rotation while bursting. In general, your moves have a priority. Number 1 is Judgment. Number 2 is usually Crusader Strike, but if you're out of melee range, you use Exorcism, or if you have a proc, use Exorcism. Next, for Templar's Verdict, use it if all your moves are on cooldown, or if you have 4 or 5 Holy Power. Then Divine Storm, if you have recently used a Templar's Verdict, use Divine Storm, that takes priority over everything else. That was my 6.2 rep Paladin guide. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from it. Thank you for watching. In the future, I'll probably be making more in-depth guides on certain talents, defensive rotations, and some 3v3 matchups. But thank you for watching. Peace.